thanks so much, Risa and Andy. It's really a pleasure to be here and to get to do some thinking and some organizing together. After all, the Brooklyn Commune should really both build upon the Paris Commune, 1871, which is the idea that people could manage their own life affairs. And here we are in Brooklyn, I think a few years later, someone tried to sell the bridge, and then Manhattan colonized Brooklyn, so it lost its capacity of self-management. So I think today is a good day to try and seize it back. And I also think that it's interesting to think about that legacy of self-management, which started off in the middle of the 19th century as something that people could feel assured that if they could run their own lives at a small scale and manage their own affairs, the world could be transformed. And I think what we've seen in the subsequent 150 years is that self-management itself and different ways of management have done the colonizing, right? Done the ways of sort of taking over our lives. So I think it's interesting to think about why art and artists matter so much to that broader historical transformation. In many ways, we can see a very different horizon of capitalism since the 19th century, and things like the Paris Commune and various kinds of social movements which had a utopian projection, right? The sense that the future was going to be better than the present, right? And that the future was available, but it was available as something that was a new time, an entirely different time. And in many ways, that idea got absorbed into the great machinery of capitalism, which promised to turn scarcity into abundance. And it was going to do that by giving everybody some kind of self-realization through the work that they did. So that idea of self-realization was tied to a notion of upward mobility, so that each generation would do better than the one before, so that even if you didn't quite achieve transcendence within your lifetime, assuming that you were heterosexual and had families, you could pass that promise on to your children, right? So there was this larger arc, and the future would always promise more than the present had. I think what we've seen, especially since 2008 and the great financial debacle, is that in many ways, capitalism itself has abdicated on that promise of the future. That future is no longer seen as expansive, and that instead of turning scarcity into abundance, what we're seeing is abundance is being turned into scarcity. The sense that there isn't enough, the sense that there's crushing debt, the sense that this is the first generation, since such things were claimed as important to life, that there'd be upward mobility, that children would not be as well off as their parents, that any kind of debt and deficit has to be canceled. So much of the fiscal cliff is a kind of treatment of the domestic population as a population of terrorists who threaten the future, and therefore we have to cut out social programs, we have to cut out education, we have to cut out wages in order to deliver that future. But that future now is just a version of the present, extrapolated into some other place. And so much of what finance, which is treated as our new master, is interested in are these things called derivatives, which is a way of pricing risks of what future outcomes might be. So that idea of the derivative, which we could talk more about, is that the future is actually coming crashing towards the present. And that future is being lived out, that future array of possibilities is being lived out in the present. And as I suggested, this is often being used coercively. One of the big impacts of the financial crisis was to transfer the equivalent of the entire public coffers of tax revenue into private hands. So one of the reasons why it seems that we're living through such an era of scarcity is there's about $3 trillion in cash sitting in banks and large corporations who are under no compulsion, because there was no public mandate when that public money was transferred to them, to do anything on behalf of the public, right? So that sets up a situation where, with other modes of account, we might really begin to realize that we're not in a situation of scarcity, And that we might ask the question, what does it mean to return the formula of wresting abundance out of some putative scarcity? But that might mean going against this turn in capitalism itself, which has given up on its prior utopian promises and given up on its own claims to abundance and invited us to do less with less. Right? So artists are particularly interesting in that regard, in that artists supposedly are those exemplary beings who can produce something out of nothing, who can take an empty space and turn it into something that is both abundant but also excessive. And I think it's interesting when we think about what kind of world do we want, we have to interrogate this question of what's the ideal, what's the principle of the social that we would want to live with. And I would say arts are really interesting that way, that they both feed off of a kind of quantitative idea of surplus. You got to raise money, you got to have something extra, supposedly in excess of what you need for your survival or your subsistence. Right? And that's the question of what public monies go towards. It's what we're all trying to account for when we think about leisure and pleasure. And so art is figured, right, within that economy of abundance. But I would also say art references a second idea of the social, and that is the notion of some excess, something that can't be quantified, something that speaks of abundance as an end into itself, something in which art, performance, installation gathers people in order to gather them, allows people to reflect and criticize and elaborate as its own ends. So what's interesting about that expansiveness of the arts is that, of course, come, as you all well know, at the expense of the diminution of the life conditions of artists. And I think this is really interesting when we think about, say, a place like Brooklyn or New York City, or what's happening to American cities that were once the engines of an industrial machinery, right? That was the envy of the world. And of course, that is no longer the case in the United States. But on closer historical inspection, it never was the case that the majority of our economy was industrial, unless we mean that things that weren't part of industry, like cooking and speaking to one another and all the activities that we associate with social reproduction, were not part of the marketplace, and then they became industrialized, right? That's what McDonald's or Facebook or other initiatives of what's called the service economy have become so adept at, right? Is turning things that didn't have a price into things that do. And that's also interesting in the dilemma of the artist's economy, right? Personal economy and collective economy. How do you imagine something that doesn't necessarily get priced, like your love, your devotion to this possibility of creating something that was not there and turning it into something that has a price? So one of the things that I would say artists are trained to do is to discount themselves, to discount their labor, to put creativity and labor outside of one another. And indeed, the notion of expression of creativity is that somehow this work just springs, out of the air. It's ethereal, it's epiphenomenal, it's immaterial, which is interesting to me because that's exactly the same way that today finance is spoken of. Right? There's a real economy which has real values, that produces real stuff, and then there's this parasitical thing. But I think instead, finance today is the place, like the proverbial statement about the bank robber, where all the money is. So we want to pay attention, if we want to make a claim on abundance, to understanding the terms and the conditions of contemporary finance, but then to begin to open that and say, if finance is about making a wager of the future against the present, and of imposing a particular conception of debt in which our labor, our efforts, our resources, our wealth gets transferred into private hands, what does it mean to have a different conception of debt? One in which that shoe gets put on the other foot, and the capacity to be indebted to one another and to generate the kinds of interrelations and interconnections that we would seek becomes the principle for how we would live together. And I think that, in some ways, the reinvention of the Paris Commune. So when we think today about one of the dilemmas of the arts, right, is that art itself is today seen as the solution to the abandonment of capitalism's own developmental promises of the years before. These are under the notions of things like creative cities, creative classes, creative property or intellectual property. And the idea is that you want to have as many artists as you can aggregated in a city because they will raise the value of that particular area, right? This is also known as gentrification. But the thing about the process of gentrification is that there is a subsidy of that gentrification. And that subsidy is the love, is what could be called the cultural discount that artists contribute to the enhanced value of the city, but are then not entitled to make any claim on. So if you collectively transform a neighborhood, a city, a world from something that was not seen as part of a global economy into one that has enormous value, and it's realized through real estate and other kinds of expressions of that value, right? You collectively as artists are not in a position to say, well, look, we just added tens of billions of dollars to the value of this space, right? It turns out that labor of yours is not simply unpriced, but it may not be directly priced. And I think it's interesting then that in that gap between the, if you will, the overvalue of art and the undervaluation of artists, we see that something of that initial model of the industrial worker is being reinscribed as something that is free of labor, right? Which makes it very difficult to make a claim to say, not just me as an individual, but us as artists can make a claim on what makes this world so expansive, so wealthy, but then there is no mechanism of account of debt that allows us to make a claim back on that wealth. And I think if we were to think about something of this historical process that brought us to this point, one of the paradoxes is that it has been, in some ways, the very professionalization of the arts. But not just of the arts, really the social compact to emerge out of the Second World War in the United States was that higher education was going to align the aspirations or the movement or the mobility of the individual to the mobility of society. And therefore, education was considered a public good, something that had broad social benefit. So that if instead of just the elite being trained to take over their father's business, people actually had credentials because this was an economy supposedly based on creativity and knowledge, what the professionals would gain was the control over that particular area of expertise, right? So getting into college led you to this career mobility that led you up a ladder, right? And what you retained was the autonomy, the control, the self-governance. And it's really interesting that, of course, this period, mid-20th century, was also the apex of what's called modernism in the arts, right? Just like education was seen as an end in itself, so too art was for art's sake. So clearly what's happened as a result of that professionalization is not only is art no longer for art's sake, it's for these other sakes we're alluding to, but the situation of professionals is no longer autonomous, it's no longer self-governing. And this is the case whether we're talking about higher education itself. In 1970, 3/4 of the people teaching in higher education in the United States had tenure, which meant that they had job security and they had the capacity to judge one another as to what should be the basis of the curriculum and the value of knowledge taught. Now that number is 30%, and 70% of faculty are some form of casual adjunct faculty. Right? So rather than being the advance of labor, the university is the advance of new labor. Right? But we could see that, with health maintenance organizations, with the disemployment of attorneys, it's not simply professors and artists that have been casualized and whose credentials no longer gain them access to this neat ladder of moving along through time and moving up in space, right? That's the idea of mapping individual mobility onto social progress, and that was that larger social compact that was going to deliver abundance. But now, those professionals, and the term for these professionals was the professional managerial class, an idea that, whether you were a manager or whether you had individual credentialed training, you were part of this self-ruling, self-governing body in which your commitment to developing specialized knowledge in that domain was going to advance the capacities of society more broadly. And what starts to happen in the 1980s, sometimes the term that's used for this is neoliberalism, but sometimes that term doesn't get us far enough in terms of its specificity, is that these professionals became colonized by various schemes of management, right? You don't know, if you're a professor, whether what you're teaching really has any value, so it has to be measured. Right? Your work has to be managed according to certain kinds of norms of performance, and universities are going to be judged by their ranking or their movement in the ranking. Believe me, I work at New York University, which raises $1 million a day in the service of improving its ranking from 36th in the country to 33rd. Right? So these vast investments and sums are accrued in order to achieve small movements in rankings as if that were the point or the purpose. Right? Medicine is practiced in similar terms, right? By doctors being assessed by how much they can improve outcomes. And now, for those who have applied to grants in the arts, you know that if you turn to the NEA page, the National Endowment for the Arts, it is an assessment exercise. If you don't have the capacity to self-assess, to quantify, to manage yourself, then you don't really qualify for that grant. And it's really interesting if we think about this. This is not simply a feature of the culture wars and the controversies in the late 80s. This is really foundational to what the NEA was in 1980, in which the drive not to fund artists, because the public funding of the arts in this country has never been more than 0.1% of the arts economy. Rather, federal funding served the purposes of legitimating certain kinds of artistic practices, but probably most profoundly converting artists' sense of their own production into an organizational form, the nonprofit. So I think this is also really interesting that so much of organizations like this, entities like this, in which organization, education, collectivity are the substance of the work that's done. It is now part of the aesthetic. We could say that that is the interesting and intriguing contradiction of trying to turn artists into professionals. Right? It is, we could say, the revenge of professionalization, because now organization becomes part of the critical material that artists are engaging. So I think that starts getting us to think about what happens aside from nostalgia for the romantic days when artists had autonomy. I don't think that we can get there from here. We can't go backwards unless you have one of those time machines. But even there, as we know from the films Back to the Future, you might wind up with the wrong underwear on and embarrass yourself. But you certainly can think about what are the ways in which artistic labor, if we take seriously that it's seen as a model of the future, starts to figure this capacity to make claims on abundance. And I think it's also intriguing that if we think about the justification for public funding for the arts and this notion from the 1960s that education and arts and knowledge were things called public goods because they couldn't be priced. And a key study, academic study, that justified the formation of the NEA and specifically of funding for performing groups was that performance couldn't realize what industrial firms could realize, which is economies of scale, the idea that you could control the unit costs. Right, the more you made something. So you make lots of Model Ts and the cost of each one goes down because you make so many of them. So every time you do a performance, presumably you have the same unit cost of the amount of electricity, the amount of dancing, the amount of labor it takes to mount that show. So that was used, the fact that art had a different economy was used to justify the need for public subvention. That was in 1965 that report was issued, the same year that the National Endowment for the Arts was launched. And what we've seen in the subsequent nearly 50 years is that precisely that horizon of the public good has now become the horizon, the frontier of the private good, of a new place to realize value. But I would say, if we now connect the dots of what's happened in that loss of autonomy and that interconnection and organization of artists, that professionalization unwittingly visited upon the art world, we could say that now artists can be a new or a different kind of model. A model to make a claim on both the surplus, right, all that extra cash that gets generated, the increase in values, and this is of course not new to finance. This is exactly what finance does. It says there's going to be a future revenue stream based on our expected returns of this particular commodity. The most notorious example, of course, was housing, the presumption that housing prices would go up, so you could get things called mortgage-backed securities, which traded in the notion that in 6 months' time, the mortgages that were bought at a certain price would go up a certain percentage. And therefore you could claim the difference between what you expected them to be now and in the future as a source of money. The problem is that that assumed that the people who held the mortgages had the capacity to pay the mortgages. And what some of those mortgage-backed securities did was they concealed the default rates. They combined people who were not very likely to default with those that were, and sold those as, top quality securities. So that, of course, is a problem, right, of untoward risk. But the other thing we could say is that the arts introduce a different framework of risk, right? Art is all about risk. It's all about trying to go someplace where people haven't been, to lead people to see something more than what they might expect. And rather than thinking about avoiding risk and avoiding debt, what we can really say the arts can contribute is new languages of risk, of debt, of mutuality, of new kinds of claims on the commune. But they can only do this once we see that art itself is at the core of what has produced this incredible abundance in our midst. And once we see that there are trillions of dollars for which no claim has been made, at that point we can step up and say, let's talk about what kind of value art can introduce into the ways in which people can be together, and what kind of labor comes out of love and both produces a surplus and produces an excess. Thank you very much.